accident. Yeah, everything in my life is an accident. I was working in Nicaragua in the 1980s. I used to be a lawyer in Scotland, but then in the early 80s I became very interested in Nicaragua, what was happening with the Sandinista revolution. And I suppose the fact that the United States was trying to destroy it, trying to tear it apart. So I joined a voluntary organisation set up from Scotland, and I went out there to work in Nicaragua for a domestic human rights organisation. And what we did was, the organisation gave it information about human rights to Amnesty, to America's Watch, to journalists, because the whole human rights question became massively politicised, as it does in any war. But in short, I became like a witness to the war, I suppose. And what amazed me was just to see how violent the United States was to this tiny little country, only 3 million people, which, well, that's all I had then. And so not only did they finance, the CIA financed the Contra, who were the old National Guard who were thrown out after the 1979 revolution by the Sandinistas, and they went up to the border. They were trained by the CIA, and so the CIA trained them, and they targeted civilians, and that's very, very important to remember. So they just terrorised them, murdered them, tortured them, kidnapped them. And so literally what they did was, over that 10-year period, from 1979 up until over that decade, they just tore the country apart. They put pressure on IMF and the World Bank to cut off loans, put pressure on other countries not to give oil. They set up internal opposition within the country because they had so much money and so much finance. And so at the end of all of that period, I suppose it was a great lesson in how the world worked, realpolitik. At the same time as Reagan and the rest, Thatcher, were saying that this was a fight against communism. On the ground, what it actually meant was just a massacre, mostly of civilians. And so I learned very early, I think, just a real lesson how international politics works, the hypocrisy of it, talking about human rights but at the same time destroying human rights. And so at the very end of that period, after my 3 years, I decided I was sick of writing human rights reports and writing articles for newspapers and speaking to the delegations. I wondered if I could have a fictional response to it, but be informed by what I'd seen over those 3 years. So when I came back, I wrote up a treatment for an idea for a film, which eventually became the first film that we did, called Carla's Song. And when I came back to the UK after this, and I also travelled to El Salvador and Guatemala, there was a very similar situation there of Americans financing death squads. American government, I should say, because there were many good American citizens who were fighting their own government. And I always wanted to draw a distinction between the American government and the American people, because many American people were absolutely horrified at what their own government was doing and were down in support of the Sandinistas and other grassroots organisations in El Salvador and Guatemala. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, I wrote to Ken Loach, who many of you will know as a British film director. And right from the very beginning, Ken was remarkably open and curious, which he is by nature, which I've learned he is by nature, and he always has been. And he was just interested in what I'd seen, what my experiences were, and I told him about this rough idea, which eventually became Carla's Song. And he said, well, it's a very long shot, but why don't you try and write a few scenes? Because I'd written up a treatment, which is more like a summary of what it might be like, but that's very different from actually writing a screenplay, So I started writing, just some scenes, and it was a great liberation. It was like a drug, just to write scenes and dialogue and give someone just lines and a fictional life. And the whole first half of that film nearly popped out, and so I think they were kind of heartened that I could write a scene, which I didn't know if I could or not. I don't know, you don't know till you try. And anyway, after a very long period of time, we got that film made, because Ken was he had other projects in front of it, like Land of Freedom, Raining Stones, and another one is called Ladybird. So it was like a 5-year period I had to wait, because Ken had all these other films to make and were further progress. But we kept in contact during that time, we became friends. He asked me to be involved in Land and Freedom, just as one of the brigadistas. So we just became good friends. And then after we went to Nicaragua to make Carla's Song, and just kind of one film led to another.